Reading isn't always helpful. If it's a good book, then you can read it. If it's runes on a half-crushed human skull, though, better to keep from reading it. This is what SCP-77 looks like, give or take. It's the upper part of a skull, which previously belonged to some unknown person. There are runes engraved on its surface, inside of which resin was found. Where it came from is not known. The runic inscriptions change every time a full moon rises over Ireland. That is, about once a month. Additionally, the text also changes on special days of the calendar, namely, during the periods of equinox and solstice, each of which occurs twice a year. The rewriting of runes also occurs during all kinds of lunar and solar eclipses, even partial ones. But again, the eclipse should be visible in Ireland. The runes have to be read aloud regularly. For this purpose, the Foundation utilizes D-Class personnel. 3 times a day, approximately every 8 hours, 2 to 3 D-Class personnel have to enter the facility's containment chamber and read the inscriptions loudly as one voice. But there's a nuance to it. The employees must be taught the language of the runes in advance, since one needs to know how to pronounce them. And earlier, before 1869, the skull was intact, and tons of potatoes came out of it. In gratitude to the skull, the locals performed rituals every night. But then the potato skull was attacked by a late blight, a disease that harms many crops. The skull began to rot, and instead of potatoes, it began to produce green gas, which caused everything around to rot. But how could an ordinary Phytophthora spoil a powerful anomalous artifact? It's pretty hard to believe. There are 2 options here. The first is that someone cheated in conducting rituals and reading runes. For example, they put the emphasis somewhere wrong, or mispronounced a word or a single sound, or violated the order in the conduct of one of the rituals. After that, there was a malfunction in the system, and instead of potatoes, rotting gas began to ooze from the skull. The second option is that people angered the deity or spirit behind the skull. They didn't appreciate his provision of potatoes, and over time became disrespectful to the skull. Punishment from the deity was not long in coming. The skull became cursed, but didn't stop demanding attention. If before you had to read runes to get food in the form of potatoes, now they must be read so as not to die from corrosive gas. Reading runes is far from the only precaution against the anomaly. It's currently being held in Research Sector 861. The skull itself is placed on a 20-inch, half-meter pedestal made of steel. It's located in a room about 96 square feet, or 9 square meters big. The 20-inch or half-meter walls in the cell are made of steel. The entrance door is made of the same material. It's completely sealed off and doesn't let in any light or air. This corresponds to some AH-37 protocol. There are 2 armed guards with a level 1 clearance on duty at the door at all times. Indoors, the object is monitored by a video camera around the clock. It's important that D-Class personnel come as close as possible to the skull while reading. The reader should be no more than about a foot or 30 centimeters away from the anomaly. The correct pronunciation during the reading ritual is checked by a microphone with a speech recognition function. To become an anomalous rune reader, an employee must train for at least a week. Specialists in linguistics make every effort to ensure this. They teach the staff how to read runes, paying special attention to pronunciation, since the dialect must also be appropriate. Since anything can happen to employees from this category, there should always be at least 20 D-Class personnel at the ready who can read and pronounce runes, or at least learning to read runic texts at the moment. In the case of SCP-77, it's safe to say that knowledge prolongs life, since trained personnel are prohibited from being eliminated, at least until the next rotation. Linguists are involved in more than just the learning. Since the runes change frequently, specialists must always be on the alert to explain in time how to read a particular symbol. Usually, they immediately figure out how to pronounce a new rune and translate it verbatim and in meaning. A special archive was created to store this data. What's more, all readers must understand the meaning of the runes they read, otherwise the restraining spell will not work. There's one question that haunts me. Who even owned this skull? Whose brain did it carry within it? And whose face was stretched across it? Since the skull is associated with potatoes and Ireland, then the person is related to these two concepts. Okay-ish hints, to be honest. The whole of Ireland is closely related to the potato, so these facts don't really narrow the search. Ireland and potatoes are like me and anomalies. They're inseparable. Their stories are closely intertwined. However, I will risk suggesting something. The skull probably belonged to the same person who first introduced the Irish people to this important product. As for who this hero was, there was fierce disputes. Granted, the majority still believed that it was not an Irishman, but rather an Englishman. Some thought it was Sir Walter Raleigh. Others blamed Sir Francis Drake. Still others blamed John Hawkins. In fact, some Spaniard most likely brought the potatoes, because it was the subjects of Spain who were the first in Europe to try potatoes. But where can one find this Spaniard now? Where the top of his skull is, I know. But what about his personality? Now, I'm gonna tell you a completely crazy idea. What if there were never any potatoes in America at all? Suppose there was some person with anomalous properties or predispositions, and he lived on the American continent. When he died, the Spanish colonizers discovered that his body gave rise to a strange vegetable, which they later called the potato. The colonialists divided the remaining parts and sent them to different regions of the planet. The skull went to Ireland, other bones were spread across Europe, Asia, and Africa, and some remained in America itself. What do you think? Could this be the case, or is it already completely beyond all limits? But in reality, all much simpler. Share your theories in the comments below.